Michael, do you have a favorite crossover event for the Arrowverse?
This is very interesting. I've done rankings of this, and usually the top one changes. But I did recently rewatch all of Supergirl, which meant I rewatched all of the major crossovers that she was involved in. Hmm. And I think my favorite one would actually be Invasion, the very first
Ooh.
one, because it was so cool seeing her meet all the other heroes for the first time. Of course, she was familiar with the Flash, but she got to meet Arrow, she got to meet the Legends, she got to see what Earth One was like, and that also introduced aliens to the Arrowverse. Which, if you're watching Legends of Tomorrow season 6, you'll know that aliens are a big part of that. So it was really cool to finally see that happen. There are other crossovers that have like bigger, better, grander moments. Like obviously you can't talk about the crossovers without referencing Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it kind of went on so long. There were like little deviations here and there that a lot of people thought, did this need to happen or whatnot? But don't get me wrong, seeing people like Kevin Conroy, who voiced Batman on Batman the Animated Series, finally get to actually be a version of Batman in live action, that was so cool. So Crisis holds a special place in my heart for what it was able to accomplish. But I think as a more coherent story, Invasion sold it for me. And you'll probably get maybe about 5 other people who feel the same way. But that was the prime of the Arrowverse. And that to me was literally the prime of what these shows could accomplish. So seeing it together, seeing them all together for the first time, that was a moment in time. So I say that would be my favorite, definitely. What about you?
Same actually,
Yeah.
because it's the best example of all of them being like super friends.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of course, plot was driving the story, but there were so many different like character moments for all of them to have. Like you have Oliver being prickly, but he still wants to protect everyone. And you have Carr being super excited to be around everybody. And of course, I love Super Flash so
Mm-hmm.
much. So whenever Barry and Carr get to interact, I love it. And I just felt like it was the most cohesive they had been in a crossover that involved multiple shows. And perhaps that is because it did not take 5 nights to complete the story. But I just think, of course, it was a younger version of the Arrowverse. So there was a lot of energy and fun, and they weren't trying to be so grandiose because they knew what their budget was. Like we weren't trying
Mm-hmm.
to top ourselves because that's the first big crossover. So it wasn't like, what do we do next? How do we top ourselves? How do we do better and better and better? They were just focused on telling a story.
Yeah, it was very fresh, and not that the other ones weren't, but I know you and me personally have issues with how Crisis on Earth X ended. Um,
Yes.
yeah. Elseworlds was kind of for mine kind of more of a goofy tone, which it worked, absolutely worked. It was great, and the Legends weren't involved in that one, which was weird considering the goofy tone. And it obviously introduced Batwoman, so that was cool. And then Crisis on Infinite Earths kind of did so much. You can see where some of the shortcomings were, and there were budget concerns with characters who were involved who shouldn't have been, and characters that should have been involved who weren't. So I think the most flawless crossover was definitely Invasion.
For sure, for sure. Also, wasn't Crisis on Infinite Earths? Didn't they happen that like part two happened in another year? Isn't that the one that they split up?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah. I think they did the whole mid-season finale thing with just one installment of Crisis. So that's what it was built towards. There was that big, like, incredible moment where wasn't it the Anti-Monitor did the whole like Undertaker thing, and the whole Wave
Yes.
Rider with everyone on it was vanquished just out of existence like that, and you were left with like what happens next. And it ended the year. You had Christmas, and then you had to wait until the middle of January for the pickup. So that was such a great cliffhanger. And but I think it started so strong. The second part of it weren't as good, so it kind of set it up for failure there. Even though it was marketing wise, it was genius. Make us wait after Christmas. It worked great. But yeah, again, I think the most cohesive, the best narrative, Invasion for me, definitely.
How essential are these crossovers? Like, if I decided I wanted to binge watch Supergirl and I get to a crossover, do I have to, and I get to an episode that, did I already say that? I don't know. My mind is spinning with multiverse stuff. But if I get to a crossover episode, do I have to like pump the brakes on my Supergirl binge and hop to like Arrow and the Flash or whatever? Or can I just like go all the way through? Or like, are they standalone episodes?
No, some of them are, some of them aren't. For example, in Vision, there wasn't a Supergirl installment. They had the mid-season finale of Supergirl ended with Barry and Cisco popping up on her Earth and saying, "We need your help," and she's all like, "What are we up against?" But if you just didn't watch the crossover and moved on to the next episode of Supergirl, you just have the mid-season premiere, and that cliffhanger would never have been dealt with. So after that, what are we up against? It actually says to be continued on The Flash. Can't remember what episode it was. You need to be continued on The Flash. So you would then have to pop over and watch the 3-part installment, which takes place across The Flash, Arrow, and Legends of Tomorrow. Because since it was set on Earth 1, it used the Earth 1 shows. But so you could skip that one. It doesn't affect the Supergirl continuity whatsoever. But something like Crisis absolutely would, because the Supergirl installment ends with Earth 38 being wiped out. And if you just watch that installment and then moved on to the next episode of Supergirl, there'd be no reference to the multiverse, there'd be no reference to Crisis, the other heroes, or how Supergirl's Earth came back after it was wiped out of existence. And then maybe like 6 episodes down the line, someone would refer to how the events of the Flash take place on this Earth, and you'd be like, hold on a minute, no, they don't, because you would have needed to have watched the episodes of Arrow, Legends, Flash to understand the continuity. So having rewatched all of Supergirl recently, it's kind of impossible. You can watch it without watching the crossovers, but continuity wise, it won't make sense the more it goes on, if that makes sense.
You'd have to Google too, though, Reed. So, like, if you were watching Supergirl in the later seasons and there are crossovers, the episodes that she's in for the crossovers aren't actually in her season. So, if you didn't know the order in which the crossover, then you'd be searching all through, like, is Arrowverse? Is the Flashverse? Where do I need to go on Netflix to find out which episode is next? So, a fresh Google or a visit to Bam Snack Pal will get you those answers.
Get the plug in.
They should have done it like a Goosebumps book, like in the end credits be like, now go watch Arrow season 4 episode 3 to see the rest of the story.
Yeah, it would absolutely been more informative if they told you what episode to watch, because of course you saw the ratings for all the crossover installments went way up across all of the shows, because obviously everyone was tuning into all of them. But like, that's very on the night thing. At the end of the day, most of the eyeballs that go on these programs are going to be A, worldwide, and B, in the years that follow it. And they might not know to flick over to Arrow. They might not know to flick over to Legends of Tomorrow or The Flash. So yeah, it can be very confusing once you see that, like, what are we up against, to be continued on The Flash? And you're like, but what episode? It was just going to be very hard to follow through.
I think my favorite ones, though, are when they just do the one show to the next show. So, for instance, when Flash pops up on Supergirl from his show, and they have like a little rapport, and then he pops back onto his, and you get right back into the action. Or when they used to do the Arrow and the Flash crossovers, it was just those two. So you knew it was like a 2-night event or a 2-hour event. So that was always fun. I feel like the bigger the crossovers got, as amazing as they were, the less sense that we ended up in. And now we're just full of nonsense. I don't, like, who knows what exists and who doesn't, like, how is it going to play out? We have 2 very old Arrowverse shows. Are we going to tie up the knots? Are we not going to tie up the knots? What's going to happen? I don't know.
Exactly. And it has, you're right, the bigger, the better, the grander, the more confusing. That's just the way it was. That's the way it'll always be, because there's so much mythology to deal with. And I do have to say, my personal favorite crossovers outside of Invasion might actually be the 2 standalone ones that Supergirl and the Flash did, because they were so fun. For the first season of Supergirl, just had a standalone episode where the Flash accidentally breached into her Earth, and so Supergirl had to help him get home, but not before he helped her deal with the 2 bad guys on her Earth. So it was quite an interesting team up there. Grant Gustin actually flew over to LA to make that one happen. Like, that was really nice. And then on the other hand, you have the musical crossover they did 2 or 3 seasons down the line. Of course, there was a cliffhanger on Supergirl where Darren Criss popped up. It was all like, I'm going to go get the fastest man alive. And then you had to flick over to the Flash to watch that. But like, obviously,
did I hear Darren Criss?
Yes, you did.
I just perked up. That's my man.
He played the Music Meister on
Of
the
course
in
he
the
did. Like,
Arrowverse.
well, who else would he play?
Exactly. And so it was a bit of a Glee reunion, obviously, because he was the villain in an episode that starred two Glee stars and Melissa Benoist and Grant Gustin.
Look at that
And
multiverse, the Glee
exactly,
multiverse.
Yes.
exactly. I mean, there's so many Glee stars in the Arrowverse. Felicity's ex-boyfriend used to be one of the Warblers. There's somebody else that I'm blanking on, and of course, we can't forget the good old Hotness, who was also
No,
appeared
no,
on
no, no,
Glee.
no,
It's
no, no,
classic.
no.
But before we go down that rabbit hole or multiversal breach, let me go back to what I was saying. And the musical crossover was one of the best episodes, because not only you got to see the musical talent, it was just so fun and goofy and lighthearted, which is what Supergirl and the Flash are. And you weren't bogged down in mythology here and there. And they even found a way to get one Arrow star on it, because John Barrowman popped up in the musical dream sequence. They found a way to get a Legends of Tomorrow star, because Victor Garber popped up in the musical dream sequence. So it was kind of like a crossover of all the shows, but it was just a crossover between Supergirl and the Flash. So that to me was probably the best. I'll just go with the best use of getting all these characters together, but in a far less confusing setting. It was standalone. It was one and done. They got in, they sang a few songs, and they got out, and it was just a lot of fun in general. And it kind of like it benefited the Flash and Supergirl's overall story without getting too confusing with multiverses and stuff like that. So yeah, sometimes it was the smaller they were, sometimes the more cohesive they were. So just from a tone standpoint, I don't think they ever got better than the good old Supergirl and Flash standalone crossovers.
I would agree. I mean, Duet is super, super fun.
Mhm.
They managed to really work well with Melissa and Grant's chemistry while still focusing it on the fact that the two of them are having romantic problems and
Yeah.
they're trying to fix their relationship. And there's just something that's very exciting about the two of them when they're on screen, because they're excitable around each other and they get to have very goofy moments. I remember the first crossover with them that took place on Supergirl. Um, I think it was back when the Flash was still being goofy, but they weren't at the levels of ridiculous goofy that they had entered in like season 4, I think it was. But like Grant showing up in a battlefield where it's like mostly women, and he goes, "Let's handle this like women." He's like, "What? I'm with you guys. I mean, you
Exactly.
outnumber me." That was such a great joke, and I loved it. And when he and Kara were very excited about ice cream, like and their
Yeah.
metabolisms and explaining what the multiverse is, was super great. I just think I want, before the Flash goes off, if Melissa is like willing to do it, I want Supergirl to come on the Flash one more time, just one
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I think that's where the big crossovers get in the way of the little relationships. We talked about how characters who should have been in certain crossovers weren't in them, and that made no sense. But also, on the other hand, there are so many unique dynamics that were brought in via the idea or the concept of a crossover, like Supergirl and the Flash, besties for life, such an infectiously joyous relationship to watch on screen. And they got a few moments here and there for the right crisis, as they should, but Supergirl ended, and there was no goodbye moment. There was no "this is it." There was no "farewell, Super Flash." And I get Supergirl ended on an uplifting note that the adventures are still going on out there off screen. So she didn't need to say goodbye to Barry, especially now that they exist on the same Earth. But it would have been nice just to have in Supergirl's final season one moment between the two of them, because that's one of the most important relationships in the Arrowverse. And Supergirl kind of tipped its hat to all the important relationships on Supergirl, but completely ignored that one. And it would have been nice to have a little reference to that. And I do hope before the Flash ends, we get to see Kara pop up one more time on it. And dare I say, I'd probably even want that more than seeing her appear on Superman at Lois, because the Super Flash friendship is so important to both characters.
They need to make it happen. This is the second thing that we're like, respect Kara Danvers and her relationships with the other Arrowverse heroes that aren't on her show, because they need to. I'm kind of done with them ignoring Supergirl. Like I didn't like it in the beginning, and now that we're moving further on, it's like, but she was very important. She made like her show is very, very important to the Arrowverse as a multiverse, and we need to, before we wrap up the Arrowverse, before we say goodbye. Hopefully, we're not saying goodbye like completely. She needs to come back or be referenced, or the relationships to be acknowledged. We love those relationships, so we shouldn't ever bow out and not acknowledge them.